Our long national nightmare is over. Clemson, Florida State, and the ACC have all settled with one another and have, in doing so, perhaps changed the way that we're going to do some things in college football. Let me tell you why. Florida State and Clemson sued the ACC in the last 24 months because of revenues that they weren't getting or they didn't feel like they were getting enough. So now the ACC has agreed as an entity to change the way that they do their revenue distribution. 60% of all television revenue will now go as you earn it, so to speak. So if you were the most viewed team, you will get paid. What I don't understand is it by the view or, I don't know. But I talk about this in an article I did over on Dawg Post suggesting this is what it would look like in the SEC if that conference decided to change some things. Spoiler alert, they're not going to change some things, at least not lately, or not in the near future. So what if the SEC did the same thing that the ACC was doing? So I go on, of course, those of you who know me a little bit, there's a lot of y'all out there, know that I really track television number as it relates to revenue. My background is somewhat in finance, so I pay attention to all of these things quite closely. 60% of the ACC's revenue will now be divvied up essentially by the view, which I go on to break down, which is further on down here. What I talk about in this article is that in the 12-year period, the 11th season period between 2022 and 2012, that Alabama and Georgia make up about a third of all of the views in the Southeastern Conference. That does not include the college football playoff views, which would skew it even more, okay? Would it be fair for Alabama and Georgia to reap the reward of that exposure, the exposure they're creating for themselves as well as for the league? Well, I would argue that it's not, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. But if you did do that, let's take some raw numbers and kind of cut through it a little bit. The SEC distributed about $800 million in their last fiscal year. So $800 million was a little bit higher than that. But in that number was everything, not just the television revenue, okay? So for the purposes of this video, we're going to act like the $800 million is all television revenue, but I'm telling you up front that it is not. So the math works like this. 60% of the revenue would be up for grabs, which means 40% would not. That's about $323 million, okay? That's $20 million a school, which is about what the ACC's members are getting right now. If you're wondering why they're very concerned about this, their television revenue is about $20 million, a little bit north of $20 million, whereas the entire distribution from the SEC is north of $50 million. And so schools like Florida State, Clemson, Miami, they're getting bulldozed, and it's only going to get worse because of the Disney deal that just kicked in for the SEC. The math is as follows. It would be about $485 million a year that all of the SEC schools are splitting up. Okay, so we know that there's about 327 million people that watch the regular season of the SEC. That math works out to about $1.48. Let's just call it $1.50 per television that turns on the SEC. That's what it's worth as it relates to the contract, okay? That's what the schools are worth. They're worth about $1.50 per person that watches them. Now, that's an absolutely boiled down, that doesn't take into account a lot of different stuff. But if you were to do it that way, you'd say, okay, 16 team members, we have $1.50 for you. That's what you're going to get when you play on, there's some problems here too, by the way. But when you play on ABC and you get one view, that's $1.50. When you play on ESPN and you get a view, that's $1.50. ESPN2, ESPNU. The problem that the SEC runs into is that the SEC network, just like the ACC network, is not a metered television channel. It might be in the near future, but it's not right now. The Big Ten network is. So what that means is you couldn't really track any game that is on the SEC network, and none of my numbers reflect numbers that are on the SEC network, games that are on the SEC network. So this, at the end of the day, if you were Georgia, that would mean that your numbers would be significantly higher than other schools. So in the 2020, let's just see here. Let me make sure I got my math right. So the math is as follows. Remember, everybody's getting the $20 million, and then we're splitting up the 60% of the pie. For Georgia, that would add another $59.5 million, another $60 million, which is what they already get. So essentially, they would be almost at $80 million of revenue just from the Southeastern Conference. That does not include local media rights. That does not include donations, tickets, concessions, sponsorship, all Delta, all these things. That doesn't include any of that money, okay? So it'd be a pretty significant jump from where Georgia is at right now to where they would be in this situation. That would be the good news. The bad news is if you're Florida State. Okay, now let me go through this just for a second. Florida State's had some serious financial problems in the last 10 years, okay? And they just came off a season where, in 2023, they were undefeated. ACC champions, did not get in the college football playoff. They were pissed, yada, yada, yada. And then they followed that up with a 2024 season where they were a disaster. And not only were they a disaster, but in the revenue sharing model that they're discussing moving forward, it would get even worse. And here's why. Florida State started the season off with two specialty games. One was against Georgia Tech over in Dublin, and they got paid. They would have gotten paid significantly for that. They followed that up with a Labor Day night game. They lost both those games. Then they lost to Memphis, and they basically fell off the map. They went from playing games on ESPN to playing games on ESPN2, the ACC network. They did not play on ABC the entire season. What does that mean? You play on ABC, you got the most eyeballs. ESPN's after that, ESPN2, then it just gets bad. ACC network, nobody wants to play on the ACC network, okay? Nobody. So Florida State played 3 games on ESPN2, which was a disaster. They played, 2 games on the ACC network, so those wouldn't even be rated. So in the scenario that Florida State's talking about here, they would have made fewer dollars than Georgia Tech. Why? Georgia Tech they didn't just play the game with Florida State. About 5 million people watched that. They also played a game against Georgia where 8 million people watched that game. And then they had a, quote, home game against Notre Dame. That was a pretty well-watched game as well. So that game would go in their favor too. So all of these things combined led to the Jackets having higher viewership in 2024 than Florida State. So the plan that Florida State wanted to get with crushed them or would be crushing them. So is that going to last forever? I don't know. Florida State's had some pretty bad years. So what would that mean in the SEC? Who are the least watched teams? Well, in the 10-year period, 11 season period that I'm talking about, the least watched teams really aren't that complicated to figure out. It was Missouri, South Carolina, Kentucky, and Vanderbilt. Will that continue as time goes on? I don't know. Mississippi State, you got to remember during that time, was the number 1 team in the country at one point with Dak Prescott. So these things ebb and flow. What does not ebb and flow typically is you kind of have your blue bloods of the SEC. And I will say what they are now. That's Alabama, Georgia, Texas, and I would say Florida and LSU and perhaps Tennessee. Auburn as well to some degree. But if you're not in that group, I mean, is Oklahoma blue blood? It feels like it. They're kind of like Auburn and Tennessee. There's a group of 3, Alabama, Georgia, and Texas right now. I would say Florida and LSU are knocking on that door at any moment, but they're not there at this second. So, and occasionally those can flip out a little bit too. Alabama's had bad times. People watching this might not remember it, but I do. So these things can all rotate. The reason why the SEC doesn't do this, there's a lot of different reasons. First of all, this shows that a league is about to fall apart, if we're just being honest. This shows that a league is not prepared to move forward in a good way. They don't trust one another. They're out for themselves, okay? Clemson, Florida State, and Miami, but let's just stick with Clemson and Florida State. They are in massive situation, I guess you'd call it. They are in a massive fight at all times with their in-state rival, okay? That'd be the Gators for the Noles, and that'd be Clemson and South Carolina. South Carolina, as it stands currently, would have almost a half a billion dollar jump on Clemson if these contracts went all the way through terminality. Okay, if that's a word. That is not sustainable if you're Clemson. That is not sustainable if you're Florida State. To be honest with you, you can tell in the last 10 years that South Carolina has been in the SEC and Clemson's been in the ACC. If you were to go to the campuses, you could tell. I can tell when I go to Kentucky, when I go to Arkansas, when I go to South Carolina. Those schools have improved themselves in ways that is extremely noticeable. Period. Go to Williams-Brice. It's still a dump, but it ain't the dump it used to be. Go to Commonwealth. Man, it is not at all the way it once was. Much nicer. All of these things add up. Clemson, they were nicer to begin with, but it's harder to tell that you can tell with South Carolina. And why? Because they got the money. I mean, it's noticeable. Clemson's always sort of been nice. South Carolina wasn't, and now they are. And so that's what's happening right now is Florida State and Clemson are saying, hey, look, man, this isn't right. And they took them to court. They were probably going to lose, but they got their point across, and they left with the opportunity to have more revenue. Clemson will probably take advantage of this more than others. But I have to say, teams like Syracuse are positioned to create more revenue for themselves than they have in the past. Georgia Tech, which is desperate for cash, this is an opportunity for them. But look, you have to win, and you have to win and continue to win, or it's not going to work for you. The other kind of problem here, if you're the ACC, it's all relative. It really is all relative. If you're not playing on ABC, you're not getting as many eyeballs. And the fact of the matter is the SEC is playing on the ABC more than anybody else. And so that's taking away some opportunity. And now look, it's apples to apples in the ACC. So if everyone's not playing on ABC, then everybody's not playing on ABC. But, when Clemson plays Notre Dame, that game's not going to be on ESPN. When Florida State's playing them, they're not going to be on ESPN. So that's the thing is the big programs in that conference are going to have to take advantage of this opportunity. Would this ever happen in the SEC? It's not out of the question. It's not out of the question. As it stands right now, though, it's not going to. When I was talking about $800 million earlier, part of that $800 million is somewhere between $30 and $40 million a year that is distributed to all of the schools. 30 and 40 divided by 16 is divided by all the schools for the NCAA basketball tournament. Georgia has not won an NCAA basketball tournament game in almost a quarter century. So they've been taking that money like it's no problem. Now, it's not as much, but you get my point. All that money gets rolled in at once. I think the thing, too, for the SEC is they are hedging against bad times. They are a fiscally conservative bunch. They are not willing to take risk with money, typically. That's been their MO. I had someone from the league office tell me one time, if they knew what they knew in 2012, if they knew what they knew in 2020, in the 2020s and 2012, they would have done things differently, but they wanted to secure their future. And that's what they did. They are not being paid as much as they are worth. I'll just tell you that right now, the SEC, but they are very, very secure. The Big Ten could see their revenue not climb in the future. That's possible. And the other thing too, one last thing on this rant, that I know this is a lot of, sort of inside college football and all that, inside collegiate athletics. The one thing to remember as well is, well, where is Florida State going to go? Where are Clemson going to go? Probably not the SEC and maybe not the Big Ten either. That's perhaps another discussion for another time, but there's only so much media revenue to go around, okay? And what's going on is the Big Ten has maximized their financial situation. They did a great job with negotiations. They're spread out too much, in my opinion, but they did a great job with that. And that's going to help them over time. But the problem is the next go-round, Clemson, Florida State, Miami, North Carolina, they're all going to be able to buy their way out of the ACC. Question is, will anybody want them? Because there's a price now. This isn't like the past when Missouri was added. I can assure you, if the SEC could have gotten North Carolina rather than Missouri, they would have, okay? But that ship has sailed and Mizzou is in the conference. But North Carolina will be around next time. Clemson will be around. North Carolina is the big brand in this whole thing, okay? And if they have the ability to grab North Carolina and Notre Dame, the SEC, they'll do it. I just don't know. I just don't know what the math would be. And the value of North Carolina is significant. The value of Notre Dame is significant. The value of Clemson is not insignificant. But is it worth, another $60 million to $80 million a year for Disney to pay Clemson when they're already paying them right now? I would say probably not. Is it worth it to Georgia? Is it worth it to Kentucky to bring Clemson in or to bring Louisville in and take a cut? The answer to that is no. They're not going to do that. So that's the precarious situation we're coming into at the end of this decade. It's not obvious what's going to happen. It's sort of clear. It's not obvious. The ACC is going to blow up. I just don't know what's going to happen when all the fallout comes down. Thanks for watching.